The arrival expecting hell, finding the Wild West. What would you do if everything you'd been told about your enemy turned out to be a lie? For thousands of German soldiers captured during World War II, that question became a daily reality the moment they set foot on Texas soil. The journey to America was a blur of fear and uncertainty. These were men who had survived the chaos of North Africa, the brutal fighting in Italy, and the relentless bombing raids that shattered Europe. They had been marched through ruined cities, herded onto crowded ships, and sent across the Atlantic with nothing but rumors and dread to keep them company. As the troop ships finally docked in the sweltering ports of Houston and Galveston, the prisoners' nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Nazi propaganda had painted a vivid picture of America as a land of chaos and cruelty, a place where prisoners would be starved, beaten, and humiliated. Some whispered that the Americans would shoot them on sight, or work them to death in labor camps. Others clung to the hope that the Geneva Convention might offer some protection, but who could trust the promises of an enemy? The reality that greeted them was both stranger and more unsettling than anything they had imagined. After long, sleepless nights in makeshift holding areas, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for the Texas interior. Through the barred windows, they watched the landscape change. First the bustling city streets, then endless fields of wheat, and finally the vast, open ranch land that seemed to stretch forever. The air shimmered with heat, and the sky was so wide it made even the bravest men feel small. When the trains finally ground to a halt near the dusty towns of Central and West Texas, the prisoners braced themselves for the worst. They expected to see barbed wire, snarling dogs, and guards with rifles at the ready. Instead, what they saw was cattle. Herds of longhorns grazed lazily in the distance, and the only men waiting for them wore wide, brimmed hats, boots caked with dust, and easy smiles that seemed out of place in a time of war. A ranch foreman approached, his lasso slung casually over one shoulder. He tipped his hat and, through a translator, delivered a message that left the prisoners stunned. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch. Fence mending, cattle drives. Whatever needs doing." The words hung in the air, almost too strange to believe. These were men who had fought under the swastika, who had been trained to see Americans as monsters. Now, instead of being marched into a prison camp, they were being handed work gloves and told to help with the chores. The disbelief was almost overwhelming. One young prisoner, barely 20, stared out at the endless horizon, his mind racing. The land was bigger than anything he had ever seen in Europe, an ocean of grass and dust, broken only by the occasional windmill or cluster of cattle. Another prisoner whispered in German, "This isn't imprisonment. This is another life." The others nodded, too shocked to speak. Within hours, the reality of their new existence began to sink in. The prisoners were loaded into the backs of pickup trucks, bouncing along dirt roads that seemed to go on forever. The sun beat down with a ferocity they had never known, and the air was thick with the smell of cattle and wild sage. Cowboys whistled and called to the animals as if it were second nature, moving herds across the open range with a skill that left the Germans both baffled and impressed. The first day on the ranch was a blur of confusion and exhaustion. The prisoners were handed shovels, fence posts, and feed sacks, and shown how to mend broken fences or haul water to the herds. The cowboys spoke in a slow, easy drawl that was almost impossible to understand at first, but their gestures were clear enough. Get to work. There were no shouted orders, no threats, just the unspoken expectation that everyone would pull their weight. For men who had spent years under the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht, the change was almost surreal. In Germany, every action was dictated by rank and regulation. Here, the only thing that seemed to matter was whether you could get the job done. The cowboys measured a man not by his uniform or his ideology, but by how well he could wrangle a steer or fix a broken gate. It was a lesson in humility, and for some, a kind of liberation. But the shock went both ways. Many Texans, raised on wartime posters and newsreels, expected the German prisoners to be fanatics, rabid Nazis who might lash out at any moment. What they saw instead were thin, tired young men, more farm boys than soldiers. Some were barely out of their teens, their faces drawn with hunger and fatigue. The cowboys watched as the Germans fumbled with tools, struggled to lift heavy hay bales, and squinted in the blinding sun. They weren't monsters. They were just boys caught up in a war they hadn't chosen. The collision of expectations created an atmosphere of uncertainty. The Germans didn't know whether to resist or comply. The Texans didn't know if their new workers could be trusted. But the land itself demanded answers. Fences had to be fixed. Cattle had to be driven. The rhythm of ranch life was relentless, and it broke down barriers faster than any speech or order ever could. One prisoner. Heinrich Keller later wrote in his memoir, "We were certain we would be treated like animals. Instead, they treated us like farm hands who simply spoke another language." It was humiliating and liberating at the same time. The cowboys, for their part, were surprised at how polite and even deferential many of the Germans were when faced with honest work. The initial mistrust began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect on both sides. Still, the sense of unreality lingered. For the German prisoners, every day brought new surprises. They were paid in canteen tokens, given hearty meals, and even allowed moments of freedom that would have been unthinkable in a European prison camp. Some were allowed to ride horses after chores, or to wander the ranch under the watchful eye of a single guard. The Americans seemed to care less about ideology and more about whether the work got done. Rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Some whispered that this was all a trick, that the real punishment would come later. Others speculated that the Americans were trying to turn them into traitors, to break their spirit with kindness instead of cruelty. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality became harder to deny. This was not the captivity they had feared. It was something else entirely, a strange, uneasy coexistence that defied everything they had been taught. The shock of arrival in Texas was more than just a change of scenery. It was a collision between two worlds, each with its own myths and expectations. For the German prisoners, the open range was both a prison and a promise, a place where the old rules no longer applied, and where survival depended not on obedience, but on adaptability. For the Texans, the arrival of the enemy was a test of their own values, a chance to prove that even in war, humanity could survive. As the sun set over the endless plains, the prisoners gathered in their barracks, exhausted but strangely hopeful. They talked in hushed voices about the day's work, the taste of real bread and meat, the kindness of a cowboy who had shown them how to mend a fence. For the first time in years, some allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond the war, a future shaped not by hatred, but by the simple, stubborn rhythms of life on the land. But beneath the surface, questions remained. Was this new life a blessing, or just another form of captivity? Could enemies ever truly become neighbors? And what would happen when the war finally ended, and the prisoners were forced to choose between the world they had left behind and the one they had found in Texas? The answers would come in time. But for now, the German prisoners of war in Texas faced each new day with a mixture of fear, wonder, and a growing sense that the world was far more complicated and far more hopeful than they had ever imagined. Culture shock from battlefield to cattle drive. The first days on the Texas ranches were a blur of confusion, exhaustion, and disbelief for the German prisoners. Just weeks before, many of these men had been crouched in muddy foxholes, bracing for artillery fire or scanning the skies for Allied bombers. Now, instead of the thunder of guns, they woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the low, steady bellow of cattle drifting across the morning air. The transformation was so abrupt, so total, that some prisoners wondered if they were dreaming, or if this was some elaborate trick, a psychological game played by their captors. The culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. The Germans had been trained to expect the worst from their enemies. They had been told that Americans were ruthless, undisciplined, and dangerous. Yet here, in the heart of Texas, the men who greeted them were not soldiers in pressed uniforms, but cowboys in battered hats and dusty boots. Their weapons were not rifles, but lassos and branding irons. Their language was a slow, rolling drawl that seemed to stretch out every word, making even simple instructions sound like riddles. For the Piyus, The first challenge was simply understanding what was expected of them. The cowboys would gesture toward a broken fence or a pile of feed sacks, then demonstrate the task with a few quick, practiced movements. The Germans, used to strict orders and detailed instructions, found this informality both baffling and frustrating. Some tried to line up their tools in neat rows, as they would have in the army, only to be met with laughter and a shake of the head. Out here, we just grab what works and get the job done. One cowboy explained, grinning as he tossed a hammer from hand to hand. The work itself was unlike anything most of the prisoners had ever experienced. Ranch life was hard, physical, and relentless. The Texas sun was a living force, beating down on the men with a heat that seemed to sap their strength and will. The distances were vast. What the cowboys called a short ride could mean hours on horseback, crossing rough, uneven ground to check on a distant herd or repair a section of fence. The cattle were nothing like the docile dairy cows of Bavaria, or the small herds kept on German farms. Texas Longhorns were massive, stubborn, and sometimes dangerous, requiring a mix of skill, patience, and courage to control. The first cattle drive was a spectacle the Germans would never forget. The prisoners were loaded into the backs of pickup trucks and driven out to the open range, where hundreds of cattle milled restlessly in the dust. The cowboys moved among them with a confidence that bordered on artistry, whistling, calling, and swinging their lassos with practiced ease. The Germans, by contrast, stumbled and hesitated, unsure of where to stand or what to do. Orders were shouted in English, half understood and half ignored in the chaos. Cattle bolted in every direction, dust filled the air, and the prisoners found themselves running, dodging, and sometimes diving out of the way of stampeding animals. By the end of the day, the men were exhausted, their hands blistered, and their uniforms soaked with sweat. Yet there was a strange sense of accomplishment in having survived the ordeal. Around the campfire that night, the prisoners talked in hushed voices about the experience. It was like something out of a Wild West film, one said, shaking his head in disbelief. Another admitted, "I've fought in battles, but I've never been so tired in my life." The work was hard, but it carried a dignity that was new to them, a sense that, even as prisoners, they were contributing to something real. The cowboys, for their part, were just as surprised by their new workers. Many had lost brothers or sons in the war, and they had expected the German prisoners to be arrogant, perhaps even dangerous. Instead, they found themselves working alongside skinny, awkward young men who were more likely to fumble with a fence post than start a fight. The Germans were polite, even deferential, and seemed eager to learn. Some cowboys joked that the prisoners were free labor with funny accents, but others admitted privately that the men reminded them of themselves. Farm boys caught up in a conflict far bigger than anything they could control. The mutual misunderstandings ran deep. The Germans were used to a world where every action was dictated by rank and regulation. In Texas, the rules were different. Authority came not from a uniform or a title, but from skill and experience. A cowboy who could rope the wildest steer or fix a broken windmill earned respect, regardless of his age or background. The prisoners watched, fascinated, as the cowboys moved from one task to another with a kind of effortless competence. They could ride a horse at dawn, weld a broken gate by noon, and haggle over cattle prices at dusk. To the Germans, this versatility was both impressive and intimidating. Language was another barrier, but one that began to crumble surprisingly quickly. Cowboys taught the prisoners English words for tools, animals, and chores. Post-hole digger, branding iron, saddle horn. The Germans in turn shared songs, stories, and their own tricks for repairs learned on European farms. Soon, the camps echoed with a strange mix of German and Texan slang, a hybrid language born of necessity and camaraderie. Laughter became a common sound, as misunderstandings led to jokes and shared stories. Food was another source of shock and revelation. The prisoners had expected starvation, or at best, thin soup and black bread. Instead, they found themselves eating hearty meals of beef, potatoes, beans, and fresh vegetables. Breakfasts were enormous: bacon, eggs, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the cowboys liked to say. For men who had survived on meager rations at the front, the abundance was almost surreal. Some prisoners wrote home in disbelief, describing meals that would have been unthinkable in wartime Germany. Here, even prisoners eat better than free men at home. One letter read, a line that would later astonish families back in Europe. The generosity extended beyond the mess hall. Cowboys often shared their own food with the prisoners, slipping an extra slice of pie to a homesick young man, or passing around a tin of tobacco after a long day's work. These small acts of kindness chipped away at the barriers of suspicion and fear. Around the campfire, conversations stretched into the night. Cowboys asked about life in Germany, about families left behind, about what the prisoners thought of Hitler and the war. The Germans, in turn, asked why America had entered the conflict, why men from Texas would fight and die so far from home. The answers they received were rarely political. Cowboys spoke of Pearl Harbor, of friends and brothers gone to fight, of a belief that tyranny anywhere was a threat to freedom everywhere. These talks planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the prisoners. They had been raised on propaganda that portrayed Americans as decadent, weak, and greedy. Yet here, they saw men who lived simply, worked fiercely, and treated even their enemies with a rough sense of fairness. Some prisoners began to wonder, quietly, whether they had been fighting for the wrong vision of the future. The lessons extended beyond ideology. The Germans marveled at the cowboys' resourcefulness. A boot worn through at the sole would be patched with leather scraps and nails, lasting another season. A lasso made from old rope would be spliced and knotted until it was almost as strong as new. Nothing went to waste, yet nothing was treated with reverence. Tools existed to be used, not worshipped. For prisoners coming from a society obsessed with rigid order and ritual, this practicality was refreshing and humbling. Freedom, too, took on a new meaning. The cowboys embodied it in every gesture. They answered to no officer's bark, no daily salute. Their authority came from skill, not from rank. A man who could rope the wildest steer or ride through the toughest storm earned respect without a uniform. The prisoners saw this and recognized a form of power they had never known, not imposed, but earned. Not commanded, but granted. Yet, for all the camaraderie and shared labor, the reality of captivity was never far away. The barbed wire still stood, and the guard towers still cast their shadows across the camp. The prisoners knew that, no matter how well they worked or how many fences they mended, they were still far from home, still at the mercy of a war that showed no signs of ending. Some dreamed of escape, but the vastness of the Texas landscape made such thoughts seem futile. Even if I escape, where would I go? How would I eat? One man wondered aloud. The ranch itself was a prison without walls, its endless horizons both a promise and a warning. Despite these realities, something remarkable was happening. The daily grind of ranch work, the shared meals, the laughter and sweat, were forging bonds that neither side had expected. The Germans were learning that their captors were not the monsters they had been told to fear. The cowboys were discovering that their prisoners were not the fanatics they had been warned about. In the space between suspicion and trust, a new understanding was taking root. By the end of their first month in Texas, many of the German prisoners had begun to adapt. They learned to ride horses, to mend fences with wire and posts, to drive herds across the open range. Their bodies ached in ways the battlefield had never prepared them for, but their spirits were changing. The work was hard, but it carried a strange dignity. They were no longer just prisoners. They were becoming cowboys, in their own way, men shaped by the land, by the sun, and by the unexpected kindness of their former enemies. The culture shock of those first days in Texas was profound, but it was also transformative. For the German POs, the open range was a place of challenge and discovery, a world where old certainties were stripped away and new possibilities emerged. For the Texans, the arrival of the enemy was a test of their own values, a chance to prove that even in war, humanity could survive. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, both sides began to realize that the real battle was not for land or power, but for understanding. The cattle drives, the campfires, the long days under the Texas sun, these became the crucible in which enemies were slowly, painfully, and sometimes joyfully transformed into something more than just captors and captives. They became neighbors, co-workers, and, in rare moments, even friends. But the story was far from over. The lessons of the open range would soon give way to deeper revelations about power, abundance, and the true nature of America's strength. And what happened next would challenge everything the prisoners thought they knew about the world and about themselves. The American Way: Abundance vs. Scarcity for the German prisoners. The first weeks on Texas ranches were a daily lesson in contradiction. Every sunrise brought new reminders that the world they'd left behind was not just distant in miles, but in every measure of comfort, food, and freedom. The shock of American abundance was everywhere, and it gnawed at them in ways that no guard or barbed wire ever could. It started with the food. In Germany, the war had turned every meal into a struggle. Rations were meager, and by 1944, most civilians survived on watery soup, black bread, and whatever scraps could be bartered or stolen. Soldiers at the front fared little better. The average German infantryman was lucky to get 500 calories a day, barely enough to keep a man on his feet, let alone working or fighting. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that never quite faded. But in Texas, the mess halls overflowed. Breakfasts were feasts: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and thick slabs of cornbread. Lunches and dinners brought beef, potatoes, beans, and vegetables. Sometimes even pies and cakes, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years before. The prisoners ate in disbelief, at first suspicious that such bounty might be a trick, a prelude to some cruel punishment. But the meals kept coming day after day, week after week. The Americans seemed to have so much food that even their prisoners could eat like kings. The numbers were staggering. Each POW received a daily ration of over 3,000 calories, almost double what they'd known in the Wehrmacht, and nearly identical to what American soldiers ate. The contrast was so stark that some prisoners wrote home in code, trying to describe the abundance without attracting the attention of censors. "We are well," one letter read, "and there is no shortage of bread." Families back in Germany could hardly believe it. How could the enemy, the land of chaos and lawlessness, feed its captives better than the Reich fed its own people? The shock went beyond the mess hall. The scale of American agriculture was unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. In Bavaria, a large farm might keep 20 cows. In Texas, a single rancher counted his herd in the thousands. The land seemed endless, stretching to the horizon in every direction, dotted with cattle, wheat fields, and the occasional oil well. The prisoners rode for hours across open range, passing herds so vast they seemed to blur into the landscape. It was a kind of wealth that defied imagination. One PW, a former farmhand from Saxony, later wrote, "In Germany, we measured our land in hectares, our herds in dozens. Here, everything is counted in thousands. The Americans have so much that even their prisoners are well fed and well clothed. It is a different world." The realization was both humbling and unsettling. The Reich had promised its soldiers that Germany was the pinnacle of discipline and organization, that their nation would outlast any enemy through sheer willpower and efficiency. But Texas forced them to confront a different kind of arithmetic. One measured not in tanks or rifles, but in cattle herds, acres of farmland, and the sheer scale of American abundance. Money, too, told a story the prisoners could not ignore. For their labor, POWs earned 80 cents a day, not paid directly, but credited to their accounts and redeemable in camp canteens. With these tokens, they could buy cigarettes, candy, soft drinks, and small luxuries that had vanished from German shelves years before. The spending power was modest by American standards, but it was more than many German civilians had at home, where inflation and shortages left store shelves bare. Some prisoners saved their tokens. Others spent them as fast as they earned them, savoring the small freedoms that came with each purchase. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound. At first, many prisoners were suspicious, even resentful. They had been taught to see Americans as soft, decadent, and incapable of real sacrifice. Yet here, in the heart of Texas, they saw a nation that could feed, clothe, and house tens of thousands of enemy soldiers without a second thought. The realization was both comforting and devastating. If America could spare so much for its prisoners, what did that say about its strength? What did it mean for the war? The numbers haunted them. By 1944, over 12 million American men were serving in uniform, leaving gaping holes in the workforce back home. Yet the country's farms and factories kept running, powered by women, older men, and, increasingly, by the labor of prisoners of war. Nearly 50,000 German POWs worked in Texas alone, logging millions of man-hours in agriculture. Across the United States, public labor provided the equivalent of more than 36,000 full-time workers, an invisible army keeping food and raw materials flowing while the real army fought overseas. The prisoners saw this efficiency everywhere. Tractors and trucks replaced horses and hand tools. Cotton harvests, wheat shipments, and cattle drives were massive, coordinated operations, carried out with machinery that Germany simply could not match. Even the ranches, with their endless herds and sprawling pastures, were industrial operations in their own right. The Germans, trained to see themselves as the world's most disciplined and resourceful people, were forced to admit that America's strength was not just in its factories or its armies, but in its ability to organize and produce on a scale they had never imagined. The lessons were not lost on the officers among the prisoners. Allowed to read American newspapers, they pored over reports of production and output, comparing them to the dwindling resources of the Reich. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and over 8 million tons of shipping. Germany, by contrast, built just 40,000 aircraft that year, with fuel and pilots in ever shorter supply. The math was inescapable. America could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast them in every dimension. For many prisoners, the realization was crushing. The war they had been told was winnable now seemed hopeless. The abundance of Texas was not just a comfort. It was a weapon. A daily reminder that the enemy's strength was rooted in something deeper than propaganda or ideology. It was rooted in the land itself, in the ability to turn raw resources into food machines, and ultimately victory. Yet, for all the shock and envy, there was also a sense of wonder. The prisoners marveled at the casual generosity of their captors. Cowboys shared meals, offered advice, and sometimes even slipped an extra cigarette or piece of candy to a homesick young man. The guards enforced discipline, but rarely with cruelty. The rules were clear, but the punishments were fair. For men who had expected brutality, the reality was both confusing and strangely reassuring. The abundance extended beyond material comforts. The prisoners were given opportunities for recreation. Soccer games, music, even classes in English or mathematics. Some learned new skills, others rediscovered old talents. The camps, while still surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, became places of unexpected growth and adaptation. For many, it was the first time in years that they had felt safe, fed, and free from the constant threat of death. But the contrast with home was never far from their minds. Letters from Germany spoke of hunger, fear, and loss. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were in ruins, their populations scattered and starving. Families were fragmented, some displaced, others grieving losses too heavy to speak aloud. The prisoners, healthier and better fed than they had been in years, struggled with guilt and helplessness. Some tried to send money or food home, but the war made such gestures nearly impossible. The paradox was inescapable. They were prisoners, yet they lived better than their families back home. They worked hard, but their labor was rewarded with food, shelter, and a measure of dignity. The Americans, once feared as brutal enemies, had become, in a strange way, their protectors. The realization was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The abundance of Texas forced the prisoners to confront uncomfortable truths about their own country. The Reich had promised them victory through discipline, sacrifice, and unity. But here, in the heart of their enemy's land, they saw a different path to power, one built on efficiency, innovation, and a belief in the value of every individual's labor. The lessons were subtle, but they sank deep. Some prisoners began to wonder what would happen after the war. Would they return to a Germany in ruins, or would they find a way to build something new, inspired by what they had seen in America? The questions lingered, unspoken but ever present, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The psychological impact of American abundance was perhaps the most powerful weapon the prisoners encountered. It was not the threat of violence or the reality of captivity that broke their spirit, but the daily, undeniable evidence that their enemy was stronger, richer, and more resilient than they had ever imagined. The numbers did not lie. In Texas, the math of defeat was written in every meal, every herd of cattle, every acre of land. Yet, in the midst of this realization, there was also hope. The prisoners saw that America's strength was not just in its resources, but in its willingness to share, to treat even its enemies with a measure of humanity. The lessons of abundance, efficiency, and fairness would stay with them long after the war ended, shaping the way they saw the world and their place in it. As the sun set over the endless plains, the German prisoners of war in Texas faced a future filled with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: the world they had known was gone, replaced by a new reality where abundance, not scarcity, was the measure of power. And in that realization, the seeds of transformation were quietly, inexorably taking root. Breaking barriers, cowboys and captives become co-workers. The Texas sun was relentless, but it was the rhythm of ranch life that truly wore down the walls between captor and captive. For the German prisoners, the first weeks had been a blur of confusion and awe, but as the days stretched into months, something remarkable began to happen. The barbed wire and guard towers remained, but the invisible barriers, those built from fear, suspicion, and propaganda, started to crumble one shared task at a time. It began, as so many things do, with work. The ranches of Texas were living machines, and every man, free or captive, had a role to play. Fences needed mending, herds needed moving, and the land itself demanded constant attention. The Germans, many of whom had grown up on farms or in small villages, found themselves on familiar ground, even if the scale was staggering. They knew how to dig post holes, haul feed, and repair tools. What they didn't know, they learned quickly, often through a mix of pantomime, broken English, and the universal language of sweat. At first, the cowboys kept their distance. They watched the Germans with wary eyes, half expecting trouble. Some had lost family in the war, and the idea of working side by side with the enemy was a bitter pill to swallow. But necessity is a powerful force, and the ranches needed every able hand. The cowboys soon discovered that the Germans were not the fanatics they'd been warned about. They were young, tired, and, above all, eager to prove themselves useful. The first real breakthrough came during a particularly grueling week in late summer. A storm had blown through, tearing down fences and scattering cattle across miles of open range. The work was backbreaking, the days long and hot. There was no time for suspicion or resentment, only the urgent need to get the job done. Cowboys and prisoners worked side by side, hauling posts, stringing wire, and rounding up strays. Language barriers faded in the face of shared exhaustion. A nod, a gesture, a grunt of effort. These became the tools of communication. One cowboy, a wiry man named Buck, was known for his quick temper and sharp tongue. He'd made it clear from the start that he didn't trust the Germans. But as the week wore on, he found himself relying on a young prisoner named Carl, who had a knack for fixing broken gates. By the third day, Buck was handing Carl his tools without a second thought, and the two were working in easy silence. That evening, Buck tossed Carl a canteen and muttered, "Not bad, kid." It was a small moment, but it echoed across the camp. Stories like this played out again and again. Cowboys taught the Germans the tricks of the trade: how to swing a lasso, how to read the weather, how to move a herd without spooking the cattle. The Germans, in turn, shared their own knowledge. Some had grown up repairing machinery on family farms and showed the cowboys how to keep old tractors running with little more than wire and ingenuity. Others introduced new ways to patch boots or mend clothing, skills honed by years of scarcity back home. The camps themselves became strange hybrids of German and Texan culture. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the men would gather around campfires. Cowboys strummed guitars and sang old country songs, while the Germans responded with folk tunes from Bavaria or the Rhineland. Sometimes, the two groups would try to teach each other the words, resulting in a jumble of accents and laughter that echoed across the prairie. Food, always a source of fascination, became another bridge. The Germans marveled at the size and variety of the meals and soon began to contribute their own recipes. On special occasions, they would bake dense, dark bread or prepare sausages using whatever ingredients they could find. The cowboys, curious and always hungry, were happy to sample these foreign dishes. In return, they introduced the Germans to chili, cornbread, and the legendary Texas barbecue. Meals became communal affairs, with men from both sides swapping stories and jokes over plates piled high with food. The guards, too, played a role in breaking down barriers. Many were young men from rural backgrounds, not much older than the prisoners themselves. They enforced the rules, but rarely with cruelty. Over time, a kind of mutual respect developed. The guards saw that the Germans were not looking for trouble, and the prisoners realized that the Americans were not the monsters they'd been led to expect. Small acts of kindness, a guard turning a blind eye to an extra helping of food, a prisoner helping to repair a broken radio, became common. Trust, once unthinkable, began to grow. The cowboys started to leave the prisoners unsupervised for short periods, confident that the work would get done and that no one would try to escape. The Germans, for their part, understood that the vastness of Texas made escape nearly impossible. The land itself was a prison, its endless horizons both a promise and a warning. But within those boundaries, a new kind of freedom emerged. The freedom to work, to learn, and in small ways to connect. One of the most surprising developments was the emergence of friendships. These were not the easy bonds of men who shared a language or a homeland, but the hard-won respect that comes from shared struggle. Cowboys and prisoners began to look out for each other, covering for mistakes, sharing water on hot days, and offering encouragement when the work seemed endless. There were still arguments and misunderstandings, but these were the squabbles of coworkers, not enemies. Letters home reflected this transformation. German prisoners wrote to their families about the kindness of the Americans, the size of the cattle herds, and the strange, beautiful land they now called home. Some described the cowboys as rough but fair, men who valued hard work above all else. Others marveled at the sense of equality that seemed to pervade ranch life. Here, a man is judged by what he can do, not by his rank or his past. One prisoner wrote, "It is a lesson I will not forget." The cowboys, too, were changed by the experience. Many had started out with deep suspicion, shaped by years of war and loss. But as they worked alongside the Germans, they began to see them not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, men with families, hopes, and fears of their own. Some cowboys admitted, quietly, that the prisoners reminded them of themselves. "They're just boys," one rancher said. "Boys who got caught up in something bigger than any of us." The shared labor of ranch life became a crucible, forging bonds that neither side had expected. The work was hard, the days long, but the sense of accomplishment was real. Together, cowboys and prisoners mended miles of fence, drove thousands of cattle, and kept the ranches running at a time when the world seemed to be falling apart. In the process, they discovered a simple truth, that dignity could be found even in captivity, and that respect could grow in the unlikeliest of places. There were, of course, moments of tension. Not every cowboy was willing to trust the enemy, and not every prisoner was eager to embrace his captors. There were fights, misunderstandings, and the occasional act of defiance, but these incidents became less frequent as the months passed. The daily grind of work, the shared meals, and the small acts of kindness slowly wore down the edges of suspicion. The transformation was not lost on the officers who oversaw the camps. Some worried that the prisoners were becoming too comfortable, that the lines between captor and captive were blurring. But most recognized that the arrangement was working. The ranches were thriving, the prisoners were well behaved, and the cowboys had come to rely on their new coworkers. It was an uneasy peace, but it was peace nonetheless. As the seasons changed, so did the men. The Germans learned to ride horses, to swing lassos, and to navigate the vast, unforgiving landscape of Texas. The cowboys, in turn, learned a few words of German, picked up new skills, and gained a deeper understanding of the world beyond their own borders. The camps became places of learning and adaptation, where old enemies became, if not friends, then at least partners in survival. The legacy of these months would last long after the war ended. Some of the prisoners would return to Germany with new skills and new perspectives, forever changed by their time in Texas. A few would even return to America, drawn by the memory of a land that had once held them captive, but had also offered them a chance at redemption. In the end, the story of the German Pados and the Texas Cowboys is not just a tale of war and captivity. It is a story of transformation, of barriers broken, of respect earned, and of the quiet, stubborn hope that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find a way to endure. The fences they mended were more than just boundaries for cattle. They were the first threads in a fragile, unexpected tapestry of understanding, woven from the sweat and laughter of men who, for a brief moment in history, found themselves on the same side of the fence. And as the sun set over the endless plains, the men who had once been enemies sat together around the campfire, sharing stories, songs, and the simple satisfaction of a hard day's work. The war was still raging, the future uncertain, but in that moment, on that land, something extraordinary had taken root, a reminder that even the deepest divides can be bridged, one day, one task, and one act of kindness at a time. Lessons empowered the hidden strength of America. As the months passed and the seasons changed, the German prisoners of war in Texas found themselves living in a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. The routines of ranch life, mending fences, driving cattle, repairing equipment, became second nature. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper transformation was taking place, one that would leave a mark on every man who experienced it. The Germans had come to Texas expecting brutality and deprivation. What they found instead was a lesson in power, one that had nothing to do with guns, tanks, or military might. It was a lesson written in numbers, in the quiet arithmetic of abundance and efficiency. Every day, the prisoners saw evidence of America's hidden strength, a strength that was as relentless as the Texas sun and as vast as the open range. It was not the kind of power that could be measured in parades or propaganda posters. It was the power of a nation that could feed, clothe, and house its enemies without a second thought, all while fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The realization crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It began with the food. The Germans had grown up in a country where scarcity was a fact of life, where every meal was a reminder of the war's toll. In Texas, they ate better as prisoners than they ever had as soldiers. The mess halls served up mountains of beef, potatoes, bread, and vegetables. There was always enough, and often more than enough. The prisoners watched in disbelief as leftovers were fed to the ranch dogs or tossed onto compost heaps. In Germany, such waste would have been unthinkable. The abundance extended beyond the mess hall. The ranches themselves were a testament to American productivity. The Germans had been taught that their homeland was the pinnacle of discipline and organization, that the ranch's efficiency would outlast any enemy. But in Texas, they saw a different kind of order, one that was looser, more pragmatic, but infinitely more effective. The cowboys worked hard, but they also worked smart. They used machines wherever possible, replacing backbreaking labor with tractors, trucks, and other equipment that most German farms could only dream of. The scale of everything was overwhelming. A single Texas ranch might cover tens of thousands of acres and run herds of cattle numbering in the thousands. The Germans, used to small family farms, were stunned by the sheer size of the operations. They learned that Texas alone had more cattle than all of Germany, and that American agriculture was capable of feeding not just its own people, but millions of soldiers and prisoners as well. The numbers were staggering, and they told a story that no amount of propaganda could erase. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. For many prisoners, it was the first time they truly understood the scale of the challenge facing Germany. The Reich had promised victory through discipline and sacrifice. But here, in the heart of their enemy's land, they saw a different path to power. One built on abundance, innovation, and a belief in the value of every individual's labor. The Americans did not need to shout about their strength. It was visible in every meal, every herd of cattle, every acre of land. The lesson was reinforced by the way the ranches were run. The Germans had been trained to obey orders without question, to respect rank above all else. In Texas, authority was earned, not given. The cowboys respected skill and experience, not uniforms or titles. A man who could fix a broken tractor or rope a wild steer was valued, regardless of where he came from or what language he spoke. The Germans found this both confusing and inspiring. It was a meritocracy in action, a system where hard work and ingenuity were rewarded. This approach extended to the way the prisoners were treated. The Americans enforced discipline, but they did so with a sense of fairness that was new to many of the Germans. Punishments were rare and usually reserved for serious offenses. Most of the time, the guards relied on trust and mutual respect to keep order. The prisoners responded in kind, working hard and following the rules not out of fear, but out of a growing sense of responsibility. They were not just captives, they were part of the team. The realization that escape was futile also played a role in this transformation. The vastness of Texas was a prison without walls. Even the most determined prisoner knew that running away meant certain death. Days of walking through empty land with no food, water, or shelter. The distances were too great, the land too unforgiving. The Germans calculated the odds and understood that their best chance of survival was to work hard, earn trust, and wait for the war to end. But the most devastating realization was hidden in plain sight. If America could spare thousands of enemy soldiers to mend fences, drive herds, and harvest crops, what did that say about the country's manpower? The Germans knew that back home, civilians were being forced into war industries, old men and teenagers dragged into service. In Texas, America was so rich in resources that it could afford to feed its prisoners steak while its cowboys, too old or too young for the draft, kept the home front running. The numbers haunted the prisoners. Tens of thousands of cattle, millions of acres of land, food production on a scale they had never dreamed possible. It wasn't just about ranching. It was about seeing America's hidden weapon, abundance multiplied by efficiency. As one German lieutenant later admitted after the war, "We thought America was soft, that they would never fight long. But when I saw how their land produced, how even prisoners were made useful, I knew the truth. We were fighting not just an army, but an entire system of wealth and power. We could never match it." The collapse wasn't just military. It was psychological. The Germans had been taught to believe in their own superiority, to see themselves as the heirs of Europe's mightiest tradition. But in Texas, those illusions were shattered. The cowboys, with their easy confidence and practical skills, embodied a different kind of strength, one that was rooted in freedom, adaptability, and a deep respect for hard work. The prisoners saw that America's power was not just in its weapons, but in its way of life. This realization was both humbling and liberating. Some prisoners struggled with feelings of inadequacy and defeat. Others found inspiration in what they saw. They began to ask questions, to learn from their captors, to imagine what might be possible if Germany could adopt some of the same principles. The lessons of Texas would stay with them long after the war ended, shaping the way they thought about work, authority, and the true sources of national strength. The impact of these lessons was not limited to the prisoners themselves. The cowboys, too, were changed by the experience. Many had started out with deep suspicion, shaped by years of war and loss. But as they worked alongside the Germans, they began to see them not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, men with families, hopes, and fears of their own. The shared labor of ranch life became a crucible, forging bonds that neither side had expected. The daily grind of work, the shared meals, and the small acts of kindness slowly wore down the edges of suspicion. The Germans learned to ride horses, to swing lassos, and to navigate the vast, unforgiving landscape of Texas. The cowboys, in turn, learned a few words of German, picked up new skills, and gained a deeper understanding of the world beyond their own borders. The camps became places of learning and adaptation, where old enemies became, if not friends, then at least partners in survival. The legacy of these months would last long after the war ended. Some of the prisoners would return to Germany with new skills and new perspectives, forever changed by their time in Texas. A few would even return to America, drawn by the memory of a land that had once held them captive, but had also offered them a chance at redemption. In the end, the story of the German Poes and the Texas Cowboys is not just a tale of war and captivity. It is a story of transformation, of barriers broken, of respect earned, and of the quiet, stubborn hope that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find a way to endure. The fences they mended were more than just boundaries for cattle. They were the first threads in a fragile, unexpected tapestry of understanding, woven from the sweat and laughter of men who, for a brief moment in history, found themselves on the same side of the fence. As the sun set over the endless plains, the men who had once been enemies sat together around the campfire, sharing stories, songs, and the simple satisfaction of a hard day's work. The war was still raging, the future uncertain, but in that moment, on that land, something extraordinary had taken root, a reminder that even the deepest divides can be bridged, one day, one task, and one act of kindness at a time. But the story didn't end there. The lessons learned on the Texas ranches would follow the prisoners back to Germany, shaping the way they rebuilt their lives and their country. The true power of America, they realized, was not just in its armies or its factories, but in its ability to turn even its enemies into witnesses, and in some cases into admirers. The math of defeat was undeniable, but so was the possibility of transformation. In the end, the greatest lesson the German prisoners learned in Texas was not about cattle or fences, but about the hidden strength of a nation that believed in abundance, efficiency, and the quiet dignity of honest work. Unexpected bonds humanity behind barbed wire. For all the numbers, the statistics, and the grand lessons in power, it was the small, human moments that truly defined life for German prisoners of war on Texas ranches. The barbed wire and guard towers were always there, silent reminders of captivity, but within those boundaries, something quietly remarkable was happening. Day by day, act by act, the lines between enemy and neighbor began to blur, not through grand gestures, but through the slow accumulation of trust, kindness, and shared experience. At first, the divide seemed insurmountable. The Germans arrived in Texas carrying the weight of propaganda and fear. They had been told to expect cruelty, humiliation, and perhaps even death. The Americans, for their part, had been warned that the prisoners were dangerous, unpredictable, and fanatically loyal to the Reich. Suspicion hung in the air, thick as the Texas dust. But ranch life has a way of stripping away pretense. The work was hard, the days long, and the needs of the land left little room for hatred. Cowboys and prisoners alike rose before dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air, and set about the endless tasks that kept the ranches running. There was no time for speeches or ideology, only the shared reality of sweat, exhaustion, and the satisfaction of a job well done. It was in these moments, away from the eyes of guards and officers, that the first bonds began to form. A cowboy might offer a tired prisoner a drink of water from his canteen, or show him how to tie a knot that would hold a fence together through the next storm. A German, in turn, might share a trick for patching a boot or fixing a broken tool, skills honed by years of making do with less. These exchanges were small, almost invisible, but they carried a weight that no order or regulation could match. Food, always a source of fascination and envy, became a bridge between worlds. The Germans, still amazed by the abundance of American meals, began to contribute their own recipes and traditions. On special occasions, they would bake dense, dark bread or prepare sausages using whatever ingredients they could find. The cowboys, curious and always hungry, were eager to try these foreign dishes. In return, they introduced the prisoners to chili, cornbread, and the legendary Texas barbecue. Meals became communal affairs, with men from both sides swapping stories and jokes over plates piled high with food. Around the campfires, the barriers fell even further. Cowboys strummed guitars and sang old country songs, their voices carrying across the prairie. The Germans responded with folk tunes from Bavaria or the Rhineland, sometimes teaching the Americans the words, sometimes simply humming along. Laughter became a common sound, as misunderstandings led to jokes and shared stories. The language barrier, once a wall, became a source of amusement and learning. Cowboys picked up bits of German, prisoners learned Texan slang, and soon the camps echoed with a strange, hybrid dialect that belonged to no one and everyone at once. Letters home reflected this transformation. German prisoners wrote to their families about the kindness of the Americans, the size of the cattle herds, and the strange, beautiful land they now called home. Some described the cowboys as rough but fair, men who valued hard work above all else. Others marveled at the sense of equality that seemed to pervade ranch life. Here, a man is judged by what he can do, not by his rank or his past. One prisoner wrote, "It is a lesson I will not forget." The guards, too, played a role in breaking down barriers. Many were young men from rural backgrounds, not much older than the prisoners themselves. They enforced the rules, but rarely with cruelty. Over time, a kind of mutual respect developed. The guards saw that the Germans were not looking for trouble, and the prisoners realized that the Americans were not the monsters they'd been led to expect. Small acts of kindness, a guard turning a blind eye to an extra helping of food, a prisoner helping to repair a broken radio, became common. Trust, once unthinkable, began to grow. The cowboys started to leave the prisoners unsupervised for short periods, confident that the work would get done and that no one would try to escape. The Germans, for their part, understood that the vastness of Texas made escape nearly impossible. The land itself was a prison, its endless horizons both a promise and a warning. But within those boundaries, a new kind of freedom emerged. The freedom to work, to learn, and, in small ways, to connect. One of the most surprising developments was the emergence of friendships. These were not the easy bonds of men who shared a language or a homeland, but the hard-won respect that comes from shared struggle. Cowboys and prisoners began to look out for each other, covering for mistakes, sharing water on hot days, and offering encouragement when the work seemed endless. There were still arguments and misunderstandings, but these were the squabbles of co-workers, not enemies. The emotional impact of these relationships was profound. For many prisoners, the kindness they experienced in Texas was a revelation. They had been raised on stories of American decadence and cruelty, yet here they found a rough, practical generosity that defied every stereotype. Some began to question the beliefs they had carried with them from home. If the enemy could be fair, even kind, what else might be untrue? The cowboys, too, were changed by the experience. Many had started out with deep suspicion, shaped by years of war and loss. But as they worked alongside the Germans, they began to see them not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, men with families, hopes, and fears of their own. Some cowboys admitted, quietly, that the prisoners reminded them of themselves. "They're just boys," one rancher said, "boys who got caught up in something bigger than any of us." The shared labor of ranch life became a crucible, forging bonds that neither side had expected. The work was hard, the days long, but the sense of accomplishment was real. Together, cowboys and prisoners mended miles of fence, drove thousands of cattle, and kept the ranches running at a time when the world seemed to be falling apart. In the process, they discovered a simple truth, that dignity could be found even in captivity, and that respect could grow in the unlikeliest of places. There were, of course, moments of tension. Not every cowboy was willing to trust the enemy, and not every prisoner was eager to embrace his captors. There were fights, misunderstandings, and the occasional act of defiance. But these incidents became less frequent as the months passed. The daily grind of work, the shared meals, and the small acts of kindness slowly wore down the edges of suspicion. The transformation was not lost on the officers who oversaw the camps. Some worried that the prisoners were becoming too comfortable, that the lines between captor and captive were blurring. But most recognized that the arrangement was working. The ranches were thriving, the prisoners were well behaved, and the cowboys had come to rely on their new co-workers. It was an uneasy peace, but it was peace nonetheless. As the seasons changed, so did the men. The Germans learned to ride horses, to swing lassos, and to navigate the vast, unforgiving landscape of Texas. The cowboys, in turn, learned a few words of German, picked up new skills, and gained a deeper understanding of the world beyond their own borders. The camps became places of learning and adaptation, where old enemies became, if not friends, then at least partners in survival. The legacy of these months would last long after the war ended. Some of the prisoners would return to Germany with new skills and new perspectives, forever changed by their time in Texas. A few would even return to America, drawn by the memory of a land that had once held them captive, but had also offered them a chance at redemption. In the end, the story of the German Poes and the Texas Cowboys is not just a tale of war and captivity. It is a story of transformation, of barriers broken, of respect earned, and of the quiet, stubborn hope that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find a way to endure. The fences they mended were more than just boundaries for cattle. They were the first threads in a fragile, unexpected tapestry of understanding, woven from the sweat and laughter of men who, for a brief moment in history, found themselves on the same side of the fence. As the sun set over the endless plains, the men who had once been enemies sat together around the campfire, sharing stories, songs, and the simple satisfaction of a hard day's work. The war was still raging, the future uncertain, but in that moment, on that land, something extraordinary had taken root, reminder that even the deepest divides can be bridged, one day, one task, and one act of kindness at a time. But the story didn't end there. The lessons learned on the Texas ranches would follow the prisoners back to Germany, shaping the way they rebuilt their lives and their country. The true power of America, they realized, was not just in its armies or its factories, but in its ability to turn even its enemies into witnesses, and, in some cases, into admirers. The math of defeat was undeniable, but so was the possibility of transformation. In the end, the greatest lesson the German prisoners learned in Texas was not about cattle or fences, but about the hidden strength of a nation that believed in abundance, efficiency, and the quiet dignity of honest work. Aftermath returning home changed forever. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world the German prisoners had known was gone. The news of Germany's surrender swept through the Texas camps like a hot wind, bringing with it a strange mix of relief, anxiety, and sorrow. For years, these men had lived in a paradox, prisoners in a foreign land, yet treated with a dignity and abundance that many had never known at home. Now, as the gates opened and the long process of repatriation began, the reality of what awaited them in Germany loomed larger than ever. The journey back was nothing like the one that had brought them to Texas. There were no cattle herds, no endless skies, no cowboys with easy smiles and battered hats. Instead, the trains and ships that carried the former Palos home were filled with silence and dread. The men clutched their meager belongings, their minds racing with questions. What would they find in the ruins of the Reich? Would their families still be alive? Would they be welcomed, or shunned as traitors for having survived in relative comfort while others starved? The first sight of Germany was a shock that no one was prepared for. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden lay flattened by Allied bombing, their once proud skylines reduced to jagged silhouettes against a gray, smoky sky. Railways were twisted and broken. Bridges collapsed into rivers choked with debris. Factories stood silent, their windows shattered, their machines rusting in the rain. Food was scarce, housing even scarcer. Families were fragmented, some displaced, others grieving losses too heavy to speak aloud. For the men who had spent years eating steak and biscuits on Texas ranches, the contrast was devastating. They had lived as prisoners with more abundance than their families had experienced as free citizens under the Reich. One former Peru wrote in his memoir, "I left America a prisoner, and I returned to Germany a beggar. My brothers at home were thinner and weaker than I had ever seen them. Yet I, the prisoner, was healthier than when I left. The guilt was sharp, a wound that would take years to heal. But the shock of return was not just physical. It was cultural, emotional, and deeply personal. The lessons learned in Texas clashed with the grim realities of post-war Germany. The PAOs had seen firsthand how American abundance was built, not just on natural resources, but on efficiency, innovation, and a culture that valued productivity above ideology. They had witnessed a society where a man was judged by his work, not his rank or his past, and where even enemies could be treated with a rough, practical fairness. Some former prisoners struggled to reconcile these lessons with the bitterness and despair that gripped their homeland. They faced suspicion from neighbors, resentment from those who had suffered more, and sometimes outright hostility from local authorities. Rumors swirled that the Pios had been re-educated by the Americans, that they had been seduced by enemy propaganda. In truth, what had changed them was not lectures or leaflets, but the daily reality of life on the Texas ranches, the shared labor, the unexpected kindness, the simple dignity of honest work. Others, however, found inspiration in what they had seen. They became witnesses to an undeniable truth. America's wealth wasn't just propaganda. It was real, and it flowed from a combination of industrial power, agricultural abundance, and a culture that rewarded effort and ingenuity. These men carried home new ideas about crop rotation, cattle ranching, and efficient work schedules. They brought with them a respect for practical problem solving, for resourcefulness, and for the kind of informal equality they had seen among the cowboys and ranchers. Thousands of former Pios would become farmers, engineers, and small business owners in the new West Germany. They applied the practices they had learned in Texas, using standardized equipment, organizing labor more efficiently, and adopting new agricultural techniques. Some even introduced American-style ranching to the German countryside, raising larger herds and experimenting with new breeds of cattle. The influence was subtle but profound, woven into the fabric of the post-war recovery. The cultural lessons were just as important. Former prisoners often spoke of the respect they had developed for America's informal equality. They had seen cowboys treat them as men, not merely as prisoners. They had seen guards enforce discipline, but also share cigarettes and laughter. These experiences undermined years of Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as decadent weaklings or cruel exploiters. The Pios had learned that strength could be quiet, that power could be generous, and that dignity could survive even in captivity. There were also lasting personal ties. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years after the war as former Pios wrote to ranch families who had fed them, worked alongside them, or treated them with kindness. Some were even invited back, and a small number immigrated permanently, becoming American citizens and settling in the very land where they had once been prisoners. These stories, though rare, became legends in their own right, testimonies to the possibility of reconciliation, even after the deepest wounds. For the wider German population, the stories of these men served as a kind of living testimony. They spoke of a future that lay not in clinging to the old militarism, but in embracing new ways of life. If America's abundance could be replicated, not in hamburgers and cola alone, but in the principles of efficiency, innovation, and fairness, then perhaps Germany could rise again, not as a destroyer, but as a builder. In the years to come, West Germany's economic miracle would astonish the world. While many factors contributed, the influence of former Pios who had seen firsthand what industrial and agricultural abundance looked like in America cannot be overlooked. The lessons learned in Texas ranches, in dusty cattle pens, and around campfires where cowboys swapped stories helped sow seeds of transformation. These men became quiet ambassadors for a new way of thinking, one that valued hard work, adaptability, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. But the legacy of Texas captivity was not just economic or cultural, it was deeply personal. For many former prisoners, the memories of those years remained vivid for the rest of their lives. They remembered the taste of strong coffee at sunrise, the ache of muscles after a long day's work, the laughter